I'm delighted to welcome you to the initial lecture in a new annual series celebrating the New School's history as we march on our way to 100, which we will be in 2019. We decided that a fitting way to start the series would be to invite Peter Rutkoff to speak as the co-author of the most comprehensive book on the school, which you can pick up here at the front if you don't have it already. That book is now over 20 years old, and much as the book chronicled the constant changes of the school, so too has the school changed from where Professor Rutkoff left off. The point of tonight's lecture, though, is not to provide information about the years since publication, or even to give an overview of the university's early history. Instead, we expect Professor Rutkoff to point us toward the future. As a historian myself, I like to think that investigating and critiquing the past can help us do exactly that. Tomorrow is the 150th birthday of John Dewey, one of the most influential thinkers on education and someone who inspired the founding of this university. He continues to be someone we evoke as justification for almost every move we make. Dewey was so wide-ranging in his thought and his impact that it's often easy to find something that he has written that connects to an initiative today. Partly this is because Dewey founded so much of his philosophy, whether it be about democracy, the arts, or education, on experience as the pragmatic basis for decision-making and knowledge. We all now know to incorporate learning by doing into our teaching. But what does that mean in the 21st century? Do what? Learn what? I'd like to think that the New School continues to ask that and to initiate and think through resolutions. The Trans-Regional Center for Democracy Studies, for instance, formed in response to the fall of communism in East and Central Europe, has looked at the wide net of factors necessary for building stable and functioning democracies in previously totalitarian states, from Eastern Europe to South Africa and Latin America. Students from Parsons and Milano have worked together to propose housing solutions for people bereft from the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. And 3 New School alumni have come together this week with the Vera List Center for Art and Politics to reimagine our university's archive in the By Any Name project, parked outside the door of this auditorium, to look anew at the remnants of our past as we face considerable challenges. We are new no longer. We have a substantial and contradictory past. To live up to our name, I don't think we have to decamp to an outer borough, which might be the current corollary to moving down to the Village from the Upper West Side in 1919, or insist that all faculty members leave after 5 years, as the founder Emily James Putnam recommended at the founding of the school. But I do think we need to figure out what we have learned by our doing, and renew our mission as a university committed to changing what it is in response to what the world needs. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Rutkoff, who will help guide us. Thank you.
Hi, Sam. Julia, thank you very much. Pam Tillis, thank you very much. Other people who I may or may not know, thank you very much. If I taught you 35 years ago and I can't remember your name, please forgive me. There's an elephant in the room, and the elephant is my partner, whose name is Will Scott, and he's the co-author of the New School book. And I'm just stunned to see them all stacked up over here, because the last royalty statement I got was $2.37. So you don't go into this business to make money, which is for sure. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will try to ask questions about learning and doing, and I will go over some old stories as a way of beginning to tell some new ones. I'm assuming you can all hear me? Okay. It's part of the pleasure of being here is thinking back to when this began, when Will and I first started to work on this project, and we went to the basement of the then Mays department store and found boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff and didn't know what to do with it, so we started carting it around and sifting it, and it was quite a treasure trove of disorganized chaos. There's a second title to this lecture, and the second title is derived from a writer named Zorah Neale Hurston. And she wrote, as most of you know, Their Eyes Are Watching God, but she was also a professional anthropologist. And she said at some point, to know there, you have to go there. And to me, that's as good a statement of what I think about the principle of progressive education ought to be. But I also have translated that into the original. And the original is a language called Gullah. And in Gullah, it would come out something like this: to know there, you have to go there. Gullah is the language which maybe some of you do know is spoken on the Sea Islands of the Carolinas. It's a kind of autonomous language that's derivative of the African experience in America. So this is where I want to begin. John Dewey, in July of 1894, set out on an interesting journey. And the journey was that he was literally trying to get from Ann Arbor to Chicago, and he couldn't do it. And the reason he couldn't do it is that the trains were on strike. And the trains were on strike because the workers in the Pullman factory in Chicago decided that they had enough of the machinations of the owner, whose name was George Pullman. What Pullman had done is he had created a model village or town for about 8,000 people. So Pullman, Chicago, which is just now in the suburbs of the South Side, and it's still there, housed about 8,000 railway workers in company, beautiful for the time, accommodations, taken care of, company store, all the things that were needed for a welfare capitalist environment. But what happened was that the crash of the economy in 1893 caused Pullman to pull out of his town and leave almost everybody bereft. That meant that about 20,000 workers went on strike in 1894. Another 150,000 followed them, and they were led by Eugene V. Debs, which is a name that, again, probably some of you know. So the point was that the Pullman strike showed to people like Dewey in 1894 that a capitalist industrial society that was without limits, that was left unregulated, as it was in the 1890s, would be very, very difficult for individual security and development to take place in. Where I'm coming to for all of this is that for Dewey, the Pullman strike, and he again reminds you that he can't get into the city, is part of a much larger social and political and economic crisis, a crisis of industrial capitalism, which tended to lay bare the inequities of the way in which the market worked. And what I'm really trying to point to is that the founding of what is about to become the laboratory school of the University of Chicago, a year later, is connected to this social and political emergency and context. I hope that that makes some sense to you. Dewey's literally taking the train. It was Independence Day of 1894. And by November, he wrote this in a letter to his wife. So he's just arrived in Chicago from the University of Michigan, where he held his first job. He had a PhD in philosophy from, I think, Johns Hopkins. And he writes to his wife as follows. So within the same 2 months of this real railroad strike disaster, there is an image of a school growing up in my mind, a school where some actual and constructive activity shall be the center and the source of the whole thing, and from which the work should always be growing toward social improvement. The school, wrote Dewey, is directly experiential, and if philosophy is ever to be an experiential science, the construction of a school is its starting place. In other words, Dewey was proposing the creation of this laboratory school at the University of Chicago as a way of, as he put it, demonstrating what he called the unity of knowledge. And that means that he was not thinking of this laboratory school as a kind of behaviorist place in which you studied literally the activities of people in a confined kind of space, nor did he imagine it to be a teacher training institute. But rather he thought of the laboratory as a place to demonstrate the validity of his ideas. And his ideas, as I've said, come down to a notion of the unity of knowledge. And what Dewey meant by this was that thought and action are inseparable. That to distinguish between the two, to create a kind of barrier between the two, is to create a false division, and that division should be overcome in the economy and in teaching and in the lab school. So not only were thought and action interconnected, that one validated in a certain sense beliefs by acting, not only were they interconnected, but they were interconnected by the fact that the best kind of action was done in groups. So action was collaborative, it was connected to beliefs and ideas, and it was integrative. This all sounds very abstract, but Dewey didn't mean it to be abstract. He meant it to be an informing principle of the curriculum of this laboratory school that he began in 1894 and then again started more up in 1896. And the principle was very simple: to avoid the study of abstraction and concentrate on the study of application. For example, what Dewey was after, and he put it into the lab school, was how do I teach science, math, social studies, and the applications of those things in a way that works for children and demonstrates the so-called unity of knowledge. One of his ideas was simply cooking. Cooking not as a vocational class, not as a way of measuring ingredients, but as a totally integrative subject, which I think if you think about, you can at least understand, right? The weighing, the measuring, the elaborating, the creation, all of these things having to do with food, science, numbers, and society are a perfectly good example of what Dewey meant by the unity of knowledge, and by what I believe we understand to be progressive education. In other words, education that doesn't act on the world is not education. And I think that's what Dewey was after. Dewey left the laboratory school in about 1896 or 7 because he got into conflicts with the president and because he tried to appoint his wife as the principal, and that wasn't kosher at the time, and because the Rockefellers probably didn't really care what he was doing. However, Nicholas Murray Butler, who was then the president of Columbia, hired Dewey and said, come to New York, I'll give you an appointment as a philosopher and as a teacher at Teachers College. Okay. By this time, not only had Dewey elaborated his ideas and his theories, but so had William James, the father of the American philosophical position of pragmatism. And Dewey and James, in a sense, echo and reinforce each other. James, in a certain sense, how do we know if something is true? We know if something is true is if we act on the basis of its validity, and therefore it becomes pragmatically true. It becomes actually true. So this tendency of American intellectual thought at the time to stress the relationship of thought and action and the pragmatic reality of truth come together and is part of the foundation of 20th century American philosophical ideas. What I've really said so far is pretty simple. Dewey founded his first school, and you clearly see where I'm going because he was about to found a second one, based on the notion that ideas were instruments, instrumentalism. Like one's hands, ideas were used to solve social problems, and that one used ideas to solve social problems by acting on the world. And he did it in the midst of a crisis. In other words, context is very, very important to me. The context of a national railroad strike, and there wasn't a national any kind of strike before there were railroads because there wasn't a national kind of anything before there were railroads. Think about that. 1894 is this strike. 1896 is Plessy versus Ferguson, which, as most of you know, established the principle of separate but equal. But Plessy versus Ferguson was a railway case. And impossible to create even that national opinion without this network that was interconnected. Between the late 1890s and 1912 to 1915, people like Dewey and James and the Chicago School were all part of an era of great progressive reform, an era that tried to right the wrongs of unregulated capitalism. Think of all those food acts based on the jungle, for eliminating, establishing antitrust laws. And in some sense, this was the high watermark of a push by intellectuals and politicians to create some kind of balance of social equity in America. And my example would be the passage in 1912 of a progressive or graduated income tax. But now there's a big but. And the but is this, and it goes right back to 1894. There were some people who didn't join the strike of the Pullman workers and then of all of the railway union workers. And they were African Americans who were the porters on all of the Pullman trains. And they didn't join the strike because they were not allowed in the union. In a sense, then, what I'm really getting to is that this high water mark of American progressivism, which was after some sort of version of social equity based on regulating the ills of unbridled capitalism, forgot about race. African Americans were left out of this umbrella. And they would be left out of the next one as well until 1935, when a man named A. Philip Randolph created the first African American union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I'll come back to this idea in a minute. 1917 to 1919 provided Dewey a chance to create a second school. And what I'm really trying to sort of begin to hint at is that the creation of this school was another lab school. And what I mean by that is as follows. And boy, I wish I had thought about this when we wrote the book. Between 1917 and 1920, the formative years of the New School, think about the context nationally and internationally. I didn't. The most ghastly war that humanity had seen up to that point, the influenza epidemic of 1918, and I've thought about that. Imagine cities filled with people walking around with masks. Maybe we'll see it soon. But what that does to human contact, the sort of the larger social psychological effects of the influenza epidemic. The Russian Revolution. And something that never gets talked about anymore by 1919, 1920, a depression. where more than 12 to 15% of the public working class was out of work, and which parenthetically enabled the same capitalists like Pullman to send their agents to the South to recruit sharecroppers, black sharecroppers from Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia to come work for less and break the strikes that were part of this labor industrial disturbance. So this is the context of the creation of the new school. Now, I had to look it up because I forgot. The new school, of course, actually began as an academic freedom case at Columbia. At the graduation ceremony of 1917, the president, the guy who hired Dewey, Nicholas Murray Butler, announced that he was supporting Woodrow Wilson's entry to the First World War. And by the fall of 1917, he had fired 2 Columbia professors who were opposed to American entry into the war on the grounds that their dissent was treasonous. There were other reasons too, but those are the most important ones. In response to the firing, 2 of Columbia's most prestigious social scientists, Charles Beard and James Harvey Robinson, and then followed along by Dewey, said, "We're out of here. We quit." If knowledge is supposed to be instrumental, and it's supposed to make society better, to improve society, and it's collaborative, we then need to liberate knowledge from the authority of the university. So not only did they try to create a new school, what they tried to do is create an anti-Columbia. The new school was not Columbia. And to those people at the time, that meant a kind of Jeffersonian notion of, watering the tree of liberty with blood every now and again. Don't make anything permanent. Don't have an endowment. Don't have a board. Don't have a president with much power. Let's give knowledge to adults. Learning is a lifelong experience. And if we can't use New York as a laboratory of social science, as a place to improve our lot, then all we do is create and construct yet another ivory tower. So the new school was, I think, to me, and Dewey was part of this discussion, Dewey's second school. The first was the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, which was and still is an ongoing elementary and high school. The second is this new school. So he created, without thinking about it, a kind of K-16, but it's really K-80 spectrum of knowledge that will go from presumably kindergarten to whenever it is we stop thinking. So if this is sort of what I'm after, and again, context, emergency, social issues, economic crisis, educational and intellectual response, where are we today? I probably don't need to tell you that we are, and I think, well, I won't, I'll tell you. I think we're at a similar place. I think we are in an emergency. And I think, to me, the emergency is a double set of inequities. The redistribution of wealth in America, as most of you probably have read by now, is appallingly skewed. A smaller and smaller percentage of wealthier and wealthier people are controlling more and more of the wealth. But what I'm going to go after tonight is something I think, to me, more poignant, and it's also connected to what I do. And that is, to a large extent, not everywhere, but to a large extent, we have abandoned the children of the cities and their education by a lack of targeted, concentrated resource allocation. And we will pay dearly as a society for the failure of urban public education. What do I need to cite? I don't know enough about New York anymore. I know New York is doing some good things. How many children died in Chicago last year? Think about the Los Angeles Unified School District. The school district that I work in Cleveland is, I think, the 6th largest urban district, the poorest and the worst in the country. So there's a real problem out there. And then we come to the topic of, or the title, what would Dewey do? We know what Dewey did. But if we're to take Dewey's example to heart, where do we go? I'm going to suggest 2 places I've gone, because to know there, you have to go there. And then leave it to you, which is, I presume, the larger New School family, to think about where you need to go. Starting as recently as 30 years ago, I had an idea that this little private upper-class liberal arts college that I teach at, Kenyon, could integrate itself if it only reached out to some public schools. So I built a program that created honors levels courses in 6 of the Cleveland and another 7 of the Columbus city schools that allows high school kids to take college courses as juniors and seniors for Kenyon transcript credit taught by their teachers. It's not a big deal, it's called concurrent enrollment. But what I was betting on is that in a city, 2 cities that had nothing like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, or Hunter College High School, that in cities where the best kids were ignored because they were not trouble, why teach them if they're not causing trouble? They don't need any attention, they can do fine. There were students who needed to be challenged. And the challenge might lead them to life-altering decisions, for example, to go to college. So this kind of network, and my program is called CAP, K-A-P, is one way that I think urban education needs to and ought to and should reach out to its public school populations. I did a little checking, because somebody's going to say, oh, you know, we already have that. The CUNY System Community College have versions of this kind of program. Some of them are called early college programs. LaGuardia Community College has a kind of, what do you call it, the one that Bard has, Simon's Rock kind of experience. But none of the 4-year universities in New York City, public or private, have this kind of outreach program. Well, maybe that's part of the responsibility we have if my understanding of the crisis that we're facing today is on target. How do we reach these children and make a difference in the public education life that they're leading? This experience that I had with this program, which I've said called CAP, has led me to other things. Over the years, I've started teaching teachers. And I do that in the summertime, and I do that through grant things. And I do that in connection to the other things I do at Kenyon. And now, folks, if I can have the, oops, sorry. This will take a minute to come on. This was not supposed to be, oh, it's not on yet. What Will Scott, the guy who wrote the book on the New School, and I have done is we've started taking our students and then started taking our teachers to the place where culture is created and culture connects from one place to another. In other words, we have tried to take seriously Dewey's injunction to experience the world and to act on the world in order to change the world. All of that's, I'm sorry this is here, has come out to a book that will be published in the spring, so you should look for it, called Fly Away, which is a history of the Great Migrations. Oh. Ta-da! Okay. Thank you. Interactive education. So for the last 15 years, Scott and I have been taking students and teachers either to the American South or, as you'll see in a few minutes, to Africa, to learn and see and touch and experience the ways in which these cultures are connected. And we've begun to find what I think are some pretty interesting and cool things having to do with cultural continuity that I wanted to share with you for a few minutes. When Africans came to the Americas, North America, as slaves, 40% entered through Charleston Harbor. And among those that stayed in the area, which most did in the beginning, they held on to their African ways very powerfully. Perhaps the most significant of those African ways was rice cultivation. There were no colonial rice plantations before there were African slaves to make them. They brought the grain, they brought the technology, which had to do with physics and hydraulics as well as seeds and growing, and they brought the immunity they had to malaria. So this is a photograph, it's a bad one, of the fanning of rice, where you put the rice in a basket, you shake it up in the air, the husks come off, and what comes down is the rice. But not only did they bring the technology with them, but they brought the basket, called a fanner basket, that made that possible. So, if you can see the basket. Those who have been to Charleston have probably seen 2 or 3 dozen African-American women at the side of the road selling seagrass baskets. What they're selling are baskets from the rice coast of West Africa, from Senegambia, which have now become American collectible decorative items. This is a pretty good illustration of the similarity between 2 such fanner baskets. The top one is West African, the bottom one is South Carolina. Not coincidentally, Mount Pleasant, where the second basket comes from, is the hometown of my partner, Will Scott. And the very first time we took students to the South, we went to Charleston and the Sea Islands. This is a friend named Joseph Freeman, who sits in Charleston and is regarded as one of the 2 great Gullah seagrass basket makers. But he and I became friends when about 5 years ago I started talking to him, and I said, he's just about my age. Have you always been in Charleston? He said, oh no, I lived in the Bronx for 30 years. I said, where'd you live? He said, Walton Avenue. I said, that's where my grandmother lived. And he said, could you send me some bialys? And so every year I send him a couple of boxes of bialys, and every year he makes me a basket. So this is how contemporary seagrass baskets are made. It's literally being sewn, and you can't see it, but around his neck he has the end of a spoon, which he uses to insert into the circles to pull it through. So that the tradition of African rice and basket making came to the United States, located itself in South Carolina, created the richest crop in the history of American agriculture, rice. It made everybody really rich if they were white. In an all-black world, because the relationship of black to white in the Charleston Sea Island area was about 95-5, because the plantation owners didn't want to get sick. And the people who lived on the Sea Islands, for the most part, stayed on their land after slavery, and therefore were able to hold on to their culture more powerfully than others. So there are more African retentions on the Sea Islands of South Carolina than there are anywhere. And those retentions are language, housing, vernacular architecture, foodways, basket making, and language itself, because Gullah is a West African syntax English word pidgin that has been repeated over generations and now has its own standing and own literary traditions. Tagode Yehefanodia. But last summer I went to Ghana, and I was roaming around a little town, and here's what I found. I found an African woman. Now, she doesn't have any longer the seagrass basket, but she's doing the exact same thing as the first slide I showed you 300 years later. She's getting the husks out of the rice. So this culture also becomes circular. This is an Ndinkra symbol called Sankofa. And Sankofa, in a sense, means remember the past. The Ndinkra symbols are a visual, symbolic language created by the Akan-speaking Fan people, also of Ghana and Ivory Coast. But this is a gate made by an African-American blacksmith in Charleston named Philip Simmons, who is Gullah speaking, and whose signature is the tight curls that you can see right in the middle. But people have figured out that because he's Gullah speaking, and because of the way he's manipulating the same Ndinkra symbols, he's likely descended from a group of other people in West Africa called Mande, and continuing this tradition without himself having any conscious knowledge of the fact that that's what he's participating in. And that's me and Mr. Simmons about 10 years ago. He passed away this year at 97. He lived in a little shack on a side street in the black part of town, and he sent 20 children and grandchildren to college because he reached in to the world he lived in and tried to act on it. Yet he wouldn't change the way he did his work. But then here's what else knocked me out. This is in Santiago, Cuba. And I was just walking down the street. And to me, this is yet another repetition of the same African symbolic language. About 15 years ago, I think you can see this, I took my first Kenyon class to the Mississippi Delta. We went to a tiny town called Tutwiler. Anybody ever heard of Tutwiler, Mississippi? Tutwiler, Mississippi is where W.C. Handy wrote that he saw a Negro man, his arms akimbo, dancing a strange dance to which Handy ascribed the name the blues. So the blues was invented by Handy, who was actually a music publisher, in this town of Tutwiler. And this class of students from Kenyon College and I were walking down the street, and we found this car. Can you see? It's an old, like 62 Chevy. And it's been decorated with all these gizmos, spray painted gold and silver, lights flashing. And I asked the man who made this car, I said, and his name is Preston Smith, I said, "What's this mean?" I don't know, I just do it. You want to hear it? So he gets in the car and he turns it on. It had a real great old carburetor throttle to it. And then he got out, and I came back 2 years later and I said, hey, I've thought about this. I really would like to know what you think it means. No, I don't know. Again, I went to Ghana. And in Ghana, there's a tradition of making coffins in the shapes of the automobiles of the people who died, so that they could be buried in their, and this is my version, sweet chariot. So that's what Preston was doing, I think. He was making the chariot to carry him home without particularly understanding it, and certainly without connection to this, because this in a certain sense is contemporary with it, but it's certainly coming out of the same cultural matrix. But if I hadn't gone there, I wouldn't know any of this. So one last example. You may recall about 10 years ago, the Whitney Museum put on an exhibit of quilts, African-American quilts from a little town in Alabama called Gee's Bend. Is that? And they did a curious thing. They filled one of the big exhibition halls with quilts as if they were abstract expressionist murals, because they were they're quilt-sized quilts. And again, I decided to take some students to Gee's Bend, and it's called Gee's Bend because it's a bend like an oxbow in a little river south of Selma, which is isolated, just like the Gullah were isolated in South Carolina. And so 2 families of African-American women have been making these quilts for 200 years. And I went to a public park because I didn't know where the women lived. And there was a kid drinking beer out of a paper bag. And I said, I want to find one of the quilt makers. And he flipped out his cell phone and he called up. He said, oh, my grandma will see you now. And we went over to talk to her. I'll come back in a second to this. What I want to point out with the Gee's Bend quilt is the language I would use to describe it is from jazz. Syncopated, improvisational, certainly irregular, and yet bright. So to me, it has all the qualities of a folk art that to me connect to African American music. This one's going to be harder to see. I think you can probably see it. This is a piece of kente cloth, which is cloth that's woven by mostly teenage boys in West Africa, which to me bears remarkable resemblance to the Gee's Bend quilt. Resemblance in the fact that it is syncopated, it is irregular, it has a kind of clashing sets of colors. To me, it again captures the same kind of spirit. The woman I met in Alabama was named Quiloa Petway. Well, that name rang a bell for me because Petway, she was one of the 2 families. Petway is the name of somebody I once paid attention to because he was the 3rd baseman for the Birmingham Black Barons, which is a Negro League team in the 1930s. And I thought it was an unusual name. And then this summer, again, I went to a little town in Ghana, spelled K-P-E-T-O-E, but guess how it's pronounced? Petway. I couldn't swear that the Petway family came from Petway, but it sure is intriguing given the aesthetic resemblance of one piece to the next. So again, what I'm really getting at, what I'm really getting at is that the 2 things that I've tried to do as a teacher in a small college is, on the one hand, build urban school networks and take the university into the world, and on the other hand, take my students from the university out into the world. And I suppose my punchline goes something like this. I don't propose to tell the new school what direction to take. These are two directions I've taken. But I would say something as follows. We desperately need to abandon the ivory tower and perhaps replace it, here's my other metaphor, with an agora, a public marketplace, a place where you can go and touch the goods, see how the silk feels, smell the spices, try it on, be a laboratory. And I think if we replace the ivory tower with the agora, we would be very much acting in the spirit of John Dewey, because we would be connecting ideas and actions, we would be connecting experience with knowledge, we would be connecting doing and social improvement and social change. So thank you very much for your attention. It's a pleasure again to be here, and my host will guide us through the question and answer session.
Thank you. So anybody have any questions for Professor Rutkoff? If you could come up and get a microphone, there'll be people either with them, whatever. Great.
Yeah, you were talking about a fellow named John Dewey.
Yeah.
And the problem I have is that I get the impression that during the 60s, during the time when Dewey might have been, really operating in terms of these experiments, that the United States was economically becoming a powerhouse. And they thought, various people, young people, thought that if they did anything, something actually would take place. The sense I have now is that many people now believe that China is becoming a powerhouse, maybe India, but that the United States is being consigned to the dust heap of history. And so I don't know that young people have enough confidence to feel that anything they try to do right now will make a difference. I think that's the true problem. I think John Dewey would have a difficulty leading people to the ramparts, and I wonder how you recommend that he goes about doing it today.
That's an impossible question to answer, but it's an important point. I teach a course on the 1960s at my college, and I'm the veteran artifact of the course. I think one of my students from that course is here. And inevitably, the response of the students in the class is, well, you guys had all the ideals, and you had all the moxie, and we're apathetic, and we don't know what to do. And I think it calls for leadership. Now, that's an easy thing to say and a hard thing to do, but it takes a kind of focused set of energy and ideas and discussion, kind of like a laser that will focus attention. Now, don't forget, we had outrage on our side, as well as other things, and the outrage seems to have dissipated. But I think we know what the problem is out there, and I think the question is, how do you get people annoyed, angry enough, and motivated enough to do something about that problem, understanding that you can't separate the problem from us any more than you can separate ideas from action.
Hi, I thank
Hi.
you for the presentation. It was really wonderful. I'm actually a undergraduate of the New School, and I have my master's from the New School in media studies, i.e. keynote stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to say, in addressing what this gentleman was talking about, I have my own business. I do PR, and I've partnered with Pencil, which partners New York City public schools with businesses. And the school that I work with is an elementary school in Harlem, 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. And they're excelling, and they're extraordinary. It's a public school. Now, they're at 70% passing for the Regency test, where 3 years ago it's at 44%, and that's not by accident. what I can say is that this year, one of the things that we're working on with the students is being of service. You know, what that means, because it gets so much support from Macy's and lots of different businesses in the city, myself included. And I've partnered them through meeting up with a friend of mine from Facebook, from high school. We've partnered them with a school in Kenya, an orphanage in Kenya, and we're starting to correspond with them. And these 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders are so excited about that. There are 200 orphans there that have been orphaned by HIV and AIDS. And they're starting to write to them this year. And I have a commitment to have an exchange program with these kids, you know, and I don't know how to do that. So I'd love to talk to you about that. And I think that's really, to me, it's not like there's something wrong. It's just the way things are. And kids get lit up about this. I mean, these children are 85% of the school is eligible for a free lunch. And last year they raised over $1,800 in nickels, dimes, and pennies to build a well in Africa, you know? I mean, if you give kids an opportunity, right? I mean, really, that's what the new school's about. And that's where, I mean, this is where I went, and I'm just really glad that I'm here, so.
Well, thank you. You need to meet my wife, who has the same sets of commitments. And her favorite statistic, which is one that's awesome, is that if the world spent 1/3 of the budget of the world that it does on arms, in Africa, it would eliminate poverty. But that's how big the problem is. And the thing that kills all of us is we all do our small, little, transformative, wonderful things, and the total systemic issue doesn't change. Absolutely. And so how do we get from these, 1,000 points of light to putting on the sun? That's one of the great challenges. And again, I don't know. I feel like I'm pushing a rock up a hill and it keeps rolling over on me.
It does feel like that. But you know what? If every single person did something. I mean, I have my own business by myself. I'm working with one little school. If everybody did something, we wouldn't be having this conversation anymore. I mean, I'm looking at it. We're in New York City, and this is the United States. What can't we do here? And that's not the truth, but it's one that I choose to believe as an African American, certainly.
One thing that you might interest your students in is microfinancing.
Ah, yes.
Of raising the money that they could then lend to people in Africa, because it doesn't take a lot to start a little business.
Right.
Like making soap or rice repackaging rice.
It doesn't.
It takes $300.
Right.
So
it doesn't take
the scale is
anything.
different. So there's a Kiva is a place in San Francisco that does this.
Okay.
So there are also really quite amazing NGOs all around who are also acting sort of in good faith and good conscience, but we don't even know about them.
I love that idea. That's great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a economics major at Lang, undergraduate. I love the connections with Africa, but I had a question. You spoke about your CAT program, challenging those students that aren't getting that challenge. And then but previously you had spoken about the Pullman African American workers who were left behind because they weren't allowed to be part of the union. And you work at Kenyon College. You said it was an affluent private school. The new school is a private school as well, but we're also taught, about social justice, also taught about race and gender and class. And so my question, I guess, is what about those students in the CAP that are not part of the CAP program, those being African American, maybe in urban inner schools, who don't need the challenge but need the support given to them to actually make it and actually get through high school? And what about those being left behind? And then also, how do we address this in terms of social justice, in the new school and other private institutions to not perpetuate the income and distribution of income inequalities that we're finding in America just because underprivileged classes can't afford the same private education that progressive education that we're talking about.
I got you.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought.
Here's one thing, and you could do it. There is a federal program out there called Teaching American History, which gives $1 million for a school district to partner with a university to teach teachers about American history. So over the last 5 years, I've taught probably 500 social studies teachers in Cleveland, which is my answer to you. Yeah, I can't teach all the elite kids, but I can teach the teachers of all the schools and all the grades who teach American history a little bit better way to reach their students. So one thing is that one way to reach kids is to also reach their teachers. And you have to understand how beleaguered public school teachers are, who have classrooms of 50 or 60 kids, no support. It's a really difficult situation. So any support that I feel I can give them is great. The other thing is, I mean, Kenyon is very small. We have 1,500 students and 130 faculty. So what I'm saying, kind of like what this woman said, you know, if we can reach out to 10 public high schools, just think what you guys could do.
Hi. I just kind of wanted to piggyback on that question, and I actually grew up going to some pretty rough inner city schools where they had programs where you could take college courses. The problem was they were kind of tracked since early elementary school, junior high school, and only offered at the elementary schools in the areas that were more affluent, whereas the elementary schools in lesser served communities within the city didn't have these same opportunities. So by the time they got to high school, where it was offered, where the college credit stuff started to kick in, you were already not even allowed to be in that track. So how do you, have you ever heard of any kind of watchdog groups for keeping the politics aside?
No,
from that?
it's what we call vertical segregation.
Yeah.
And the district that I'm most familiar with is called Shaker Heights, which is the second most affluent district in the Cleveland area, and they are a model of that kind of, you stamp some kid's forehead with it says honors and do it in 5th grade and it never changes. I just, you know, this is a meager little attack because it's a very important question, so I don't have a good answer, but what I say is something like, I don't want to know whether a student is an honor student. I want to know whether the teacher thinks they can do the work in this course. So at least to sort of say, you know, some version of multiple intelligences, some kids are good at some things, some kids are good at other things. Let's stop pigeonholing them. But it's a huge political issue, and I'll say it, AP makes it worse. The Walmart of education.
Hello, Professor Rutkoff.
Hi.
My question is, where are you going next, and what do you hope to
And can
find?
you come?
Yeah, and can I come? I went with him to Paris. It was wonderful, at Kenyon. And it truly is transformative experiences. But where are you going next? What do you hope to find? What you know, are you hoping to be surprised by?
Since you had such a bad time in Paris, we're going back. I'm taking an American Studies senior seminar to look at African American and white intellectuals in Paris in the 1920s. So to do a kind of, as Matt knows, social geography, photographic, archival investigation of that kind of life. And again, going there to knowing there. But I would love to start going back to the South as well, because it just, actually, my dream is something like this. 200 teachers, a week in Liverpool, where the slave ships were made, a weekend in West Africa, where they went, a week in Barbados, where they took them, and a week in South Carolina, where they arrived. That would teach somebody something.
Thank you.
Got a couple of $1 million?
Question, when do you teach students how to write? And I just wondered if you had an example of the ways that skill building was melded into this kind of approach or not, or you know, what do you think about that kind of attack and how you answer that?
I think what it does is it's caricatures progressive education as if to say, well, if they're playing with those rods or building blocks, they can't be writing. Well, that's, to me, what you do is you integrate that skill into the larger context of what you're doing. So if we're cooking, then we write a recipe book. And it seems to me that there's lots of ways to do this that are fruitful.
I appreciated a great many things you said in your talk, in particular the emphasis on collaborative learning, which I think is something that needs more emphasis. And in particular, collaboration is a necessary part of knowledge creation. So I guess I have a two-part question. One of them is about continuing education. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts you have about how, as we move beyond the university, one should conceive of continuing education in a truly collaborative way? And the second, a way of thinking about continuing education is something that's involved in the collaborative generation of knowledge. Because I know the way it is often presented, it's like, well, knowledge is generated in research universities. It's not generated in courses where people learn things, and certainly not in continuing education.
This is an easy answer, but part of the answer is the internet. The internet is a way to keep people in touch with ideas and knowledge and the production of knowledge and collaboration after the 4 years are up. I can't tell you how many students will always say to me, oh God, I don't want to graduate, I have so many more courses to take. And I say, well, wait a minute, nobody says you're going to close the book. Once you graduate, keep learning. But the other is that's a place where knowledge can be posted. The courses that we took to the South in a class called North by South created a website which has 10 years of stuff piled on it, and it's the most tapped on website for information about the Great Migration. And it was all student done. I did nothing. So each year students kept adding to that. So it's collaborative, it's cumulative, it's student driven, and it's public. So does that help?
Hi, Professor Rutkoff. My name is Alex Goldblum. I'm a student in the MA in Media Studies program.
Right.
I'm very interested in your idea about the direction for the new school. You said that we should abandon the ivory tower and replace it with the Agora. And my question for you is, has progressive education tamed the ills of capitalism? If so, how? And if not, how can we take this further?
Well, clearly it hasn't. If you go back to the heyday of trade unions, where there were workers' education classes and people read stuff and talked to it about it. In other words, education doesn't have to just take place in a college. It doesn't just have to take place at the time you're 18 to 22. So the reverse of the internet is also where are the other parts of the social and political world that education can occur. So they don't, again, you take the school to the world as much as you connect the school to the world. So to me, part of the answer is that old notion of trying to recreate some version of a working class culture where intellectual ideas, writing, reading, this is not exactly what you're asking, but for example, I've written a couple of novels, and I wrote them because I connected to other writers, and we sat down once a week and read each other's stuff at the age of 50-something. So there are ways to do this informally, voluntarily, as well as through institutions. We sometimes, I think, suffer for a lack of imagination. Sure. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.